Girl in white. He was sulking a little, standing at the sidelines while all the other men danced with their pretty partners. His girl had not come to the dance that night. Her mother was ill, and so his girl had remained at her side. A fine pious act, he thought sourly, but it left him at loose ends. His friend, Ernesto, came up to him between sets with a cold drink and some words of encouragement. After all, Anita is not the only girl in the world, Ernesto said. There are many pretty girls here tonight. Dance with one of them. Bolstered by his friend's words, he started looking around the dance hall. His eye fell upon a beautiful young girl standing wistfully at the edge of the floor beside the door to the terrace. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown and her skin was pale as the moon. Her dark eyes watched the dance hungrily from her position behind a tall fern, and he felt his heart beat faster. Such a lovely woman should be dancing. He made his way through the bustling crowd and bowed to the girl in white. She looked startled by his addresses, as if she had not expected anyone to notice her that night. But she readily assented to dance with him, and he proudly led her out onto the floor for the next set, all thoughts of Anita gone from his mind. Ernesto and some of his other friends gave him odd looks as he danced with the girl in white. A few times, the man opposite them bumped right into them as if he had not seen his partner at all. He was furious and wanted to stop the dance and make the man apologize to the girl in white, but she just laughed and hushed him. When the dance was over, he hurried to get his fair partner a drink. Ernesto approached him at the refreshment table. When I told you to dance, I meant with a partner, his friend teased him. I was dancing with a partner, he replied, irritated by his friend's remark. The loveliest girl in all of Mexico. You've had too much to drink, my friend, Ernesto replied. You were dancing by yourself out there. He glared at his friend and turned away without answering him. Making his way back to the girl in white, he handed her a glass and asked her to stroll with him along the terrace. The night was beautiful, the sky full of stars, and he stared at the girl in white with his heart in his eyes as they stood looking out over the beautiful scene. The girl in white turned to him with a sigh and said, "Thank you for the dance, senor. It has been a very long time since I had such pleasure." "Let us dance again, then," he said infatuatedly. But she shook her head. "I must leave now," she said, catching up her skirts with one hand and drifting toward the stairs at the side of the terrace. "Please don't go," he pleaded, following her. "I must," she said, turning to look at him. Her eyes softened when she saw the look on his face. "Come with me," she invited, holding out a pale hand. His heart pounded rapidly at the thought. More than anything in the world, he wanted to go with this lovely girl. And then his mind registered the fact that he could see the stone wall of the terrace through the girl's hand. His desire melted away before the shock of that realization. He looked into her face again and realized that she was fading away before his eyes. At the look of horror on his face, the girl gave a sad laugh and dropped her hand, which was nearly transparent now. "Goodbye," she said, her body becoming thin and misty. "Goodbye." Then she was gone. He gave a shout of terror when he realized he had been dancing with a ghost. He bolted from the premises, leaving his horse behind, and ran all the way home. When Ernesto came the next day to bring him his horse, he told his friend the whole story. Ernesto whistled in awe. "You saw the spirit of Consuela, my friend," he said. "She was the daughter of one of the local aristocracy who lived in this region more than 100 years ago. She died of consumption the night before her first ball, and they say her spirit sometimes attends the local dances, hoping to claim one of the dances that she missed." He shuddered at the thought of his dance with the ghost. "I will not be visiting that dance hall again," he told Ernesto. "From now on, all my dances will be with Anita." And he kept his word. Going courting. J. Dawson had two goals in life: to find a rich vein of gold and to find a bride. So far, he hadn't had any luck either with the gold or the ladies. His smooth Eastern manners seemed rather sissy and irritating among the rough miners and rowdy residents of a wild western town. He courted the schoolteacher, the local farmers' daughters, and even took to visiting a few of the other entertainers at the saloon. All to no avail. Then one day, Jay Dawson's lifeless body was found at the bottom of a cliff. He had fallen several hundred feet off the mountain where he was prospecting for gold. He was buried in Buckskin Cemetery with a small service, and everyone forgot about him. Until 2 days after the funeral, the sheriff found the remains of Jay Dawson in the local saloon, lying in the bed of a lady of the evening that he had courted a few months back. She had been sleeping off another busy night when she awoke to find Jay Dawson's remains beside her. The sheriff calmed the hysterical woman and then took Jay Dawson back to the graveyard to bury him again. Naturally, no one knew anything. The miners avowed their innocence, and the shopkeepers and businessmen claimed their ignorance. The town treated the matter as a joke, speculating privately on who had dug up poor old Jay Dawson. 3 days later, Jay Dawson was found at the schoolhouse. He was propped against the doorpost, a love note addressed to the teacher in his hand. After being dead a week, he was not a pretty sight. The sheriff removed the corpse a second time and had the body buried as deeply as possible. He piled heavy stones atop the grave, and Jay Dawson remained in his grave for several weeks. Then came a spate of activity. Jay Dawson was found sitting on the porch of the local advocate's house, clutching flowers with a note addressed to the eldest daughter. Next, he was found sitting on his favorite bar stool with a box of sweets addressed to one of the pretty lady entertainers. He visited several prosperous businessmen's daughters with love letters and bouquets of wildflowers. Finally, the sheriff hired a couple local boys to watch the grave. One night the boy roused the sheriff from his bed. He came up out of the grave. I swear, it was Jay Dawson. He came out of the grave and started picking wildflowers. The boy was hysterical and wouldn't calm down till the sheriff went to the graveyard and saw for himself that the earth of Jay Dawson's grave was disturbed. The next morning the sheriff found the rotting corpse at the home of his own sweetheart. And that was the last straw. I have had enough of his shenanigans, the sheriff said. If he is going to behave like he belongs in a cesspool, then that is where he belongs. The sheriff grabbed the moldering body of Jay Dawson and dragged it down the road to an old outhouse that stood near an abandoned shanty town. He ripped off the wooden seat and threw Jay Dawson down into the muck. Then he tore down the outhouse and buried Jay Dawson inside. That was the last time Jay Dawson ever went courting. Green Lantern. There once was a lighthouse keeper who had lived on St. Martin's Island with his children, whom he loved dearly. They were all alone there, for the mother had died long before. Wanting the best for his daughter and son, the keeper had insisted that they continue their education, and for this purpose had purchased a small dory for them, which they rowed across to the mainland each day to attend school. One spring after, the children were rowing home from school when they were caught in a sudden squall. Their rowboat overturned and the children were thrown into the depths of the lake, never to be seen again. Their bodies were never recovered. The shattered father searched the beaches of St. Martin's Island every night for the rest of his life, hoping to find his children. After his death, people started seeing the light of a green lantern moving along the beaches of St. Martin just before a storm. Folks said it was the spirit of the dead lighthouse keeper continuing his search. Others claimed that the phantom lighthouse keeper was still on duty, using his lantern to guide ships to safety so their crews would not share the fate of his poor little children. Haunted Christmas. The soft thud of following footsteps echoed behind him as he hurried through the snowflakes toward home. They kept pace with him, quickening when he quickened and slowing when he slowed. It was creepy. His flesh crawled at the sound and he sped up, cursing himself for walking home alone from the midnight Christmas mass. Normally not a pious man, the middle-aged bachelor had suddenly been struck by a wish to hear the old Christmas song sung once again by a church choir and had walked across town to attend the service. Now he regretted his choice, as he passed dark house after dark house in the snowy night, and the footsteps ever followed. He sped up until he was nearly running and skidded into his street. A few more paces brought him to the bottom of his front steps, and as he dashed up them, he realized suddenly that the following footsteps had ceased abruptly. He glanced behind him at the cross street from which he had just turned and saw only one pair of footprints in the snow-covered street when there should have been two. He frowned in puzzlement and then shuddered as a cold breeze struck him, driving snow against his collar, and slammed against the door. Almost, it seemed to pass through the door, but that was superstitious nonsense. His hand was shaking as he unlocked the front door and hurried inside. He expected darkness, but was delighted to see the yellow glow of firelight coming from his study doorway upstairs. His old housekeeper, whom he thought firmly asleep in her attic bedroom, must have lit the fire pending his return. He shrugged out of his coat and paused for a moment, amazed to find it still warm and dry, though he had walked for more than a mile through a snowstorm. It was almost as if he'd been walking in a bubble of calm air, though he remembered the soft snowflakes hitting his face when he first stepped out of church. Before the mysterious footsteps began, his shudder was interrupted by a shout of greeting as his old friend Andy came hurrying out of the study. His whole face lit up in a grin at the unexpected surprise. The two men shook hands heartily and retreated back to the warmth of the firelight, talking so fast they stumbled over each other's words. Andy had left town years ago to take a government job in D.C., and they hadn't seen each other since. Nearly an hour passed before it occurred to him that his guest might be hungry. His offer of a meal was instantly accepted, but Andy was unwilling to leave the comfort of the fire to eat in the kitchen, so he jogged downstairs alone to fetch some food. He didn't wonder at his friend's reluctance to join him in the kitchen. Andy had looked very pale and had kept shivering with cold while they talked. He hoped his friend wasn't ailing for anything. A few moments later he was back with warmed-up meat and potatoes and a couple of glasses of beer, apologizing profusely as he handed Andy a plate for the mismatched dinnerware. Andy just laughed and hunkered down to eat. When they were both finished, he showed his friend to a guest room and then tumbled into his own bed to sleep, all his apprehension caused by mysterious footsteps forgotten in the visit of his friend. He jumped out of bed Christmas morning and dashed immediately downstairs to the guest room to rouse his friend. Andy wasn't there, and the bed had not been slept in. That was odd. He ran down to look in the study, but Andy wasn't there either, and one plate full of food was sitting on the end table beside his old friend's chair. It was completely untouched, though he'd seen Andy eating from it the night before. Skin creeping at the thought, he ran to the kitchen and asked his housekeeper if she'd seen Andy. But the housekeeper had seen no one either the previous night or this morning. He flopped down on the bottom step of the staircase, completely baffled. Where had Andy gone? It was a mystery that plagued him all Christmas Day, and he did not enjoy his holiday dinner at all, a fact that annoyed his housekeeper. He was awakened the next morning from a restless sleep by the sound of the front door bell. He stumbled out of bed and was splashing water from the bedside pitcher onto his sleepy eyes when a knock came at his bedroom door. When he answered, his housekeeper handed him a telegram that had just arrived. As she hurried back downstairs to prepare his breakfast, he opened it curiously, not knowing who would be telegraphing him so urgently. As he read the telegram, he started to tremble. The message was short and to the point. Andy's family regretted to inform him that his old friend Andy had passed away on Christmas Eve in his home in Washington, D.C. He sat down hard on the bed, the telegram fluttering away from his hand. It must have been Andy who had followed him home on Christmas Eve. That would explain the eerie footsteps and the dry coat in the middle of the snowstorm. He'd spent Christmas Eve with a ghost. A baker's dozen. Back in the old days, I had a successful bake shop in Albany. I had a good business, a plump wife, and a big family. I was a happy man. But trouble came to my shop one year in the guise of an ugly old woman. She entered my shop a few minutes before closing and said, "I wish to have a dozen cookies." She pointed to my special St. Nicholas cookies that were sitting out on a tray. So I counted out 12 cookies for her. The old woman's eyes narrowed when she saw the cookies. "Only 12?" she asked. I knew at once what she wanted. There were some bakers in town who sometimes gave an extra cookie to their customers, but I was appalled by the custom. What man of sense would give away an extra cookie for free? "I asked for a dozen cookies, and you only give me 12, the woman said. "A dozen is 12, my good woman, and that is what I have given you," I replied. "I ordered a dozen cookies, not 12, said the old woman. I was upset by this demand. I always gave my customers exactly what they paid for. But I was a thrifty man, and it was against my nature to give away something for nothing. "I have a family to support," I said stiffly. "If I give away all my cookies, how can I feed my family? A dozen is 12, not 13. Take it or leave it." "Very well," said she, and left the shop without taking the cookies. From that moment, my luck changed. The next day, my cakes were stolen out of my shop, and the thieves were never found. Then my bread refused to rise. For a week, every loaf of bread I made was so heavy that it fell right through the oven and into the fire. The next week, the bread rose so high that it actually floated up the chimney. I was frightened when I saw the loaves floating away across the rooftops. That was the first moment I realized I had been bewitched. It was then that I remembered the old woman who came to my shop, and I was afraid. The next week, the old woman appeared again in my shop and demanded a baker's dozen of the latest batch of my cookies. I was angry. How dare she show her face in my shop after all the bad luck she sent my way? I cursed her soundly and showed her the door. Things became worse for me then. My bread soured, and my artichokes, donuts, were a disgrace. Every cake I made collapsed as soon as it came out of the oven, and my gingerbread children and my cookies lost their flavor. Word was getting around that my bake shop was no good, and one by one, my customers were falling away. I was angry now, and stubborn. No witch was going to defeat me. When she came to my bake shop a third time to demand a baker's dozen of cookies, I told her to go to the devil, and I locked the door behind her. After that day, everything I baked was either burnt or soggy, too light or too heavy. My customers began to avoid my cursed shop, even those who had come to me every day for years. Finally, my family and I were the only ones eating my baking, and my money was running out. I was desperate. I took myself to church and began to pray to St. Nicholas, the patron saint of merchants, to lift the witch's curse from myself and my family. "Come and advise me, St. Nicholas, for my family is in dire straits and I need good counsel against this evil witch who stands against us," I prayed. Then I trudged wearily back to my empty shop, wondering what to do. I stirred up a batch of St. Nicholas cookies and put them into the oven to bake, wondering how this lot would turn out. Too much cinnamon? Too little? Burnt? Underdone? To my surprise, they came out perfectly. I frosted them carefully and put my first successful baking in weeks onto a tray where they could be seen through the window. When I looked up, Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, was standing in front of me. I knew him at once, this patron saint of merchants, sailors, and children. He was not carrying his gold staff or wearing the red bishop's robes and mired hat that appeared on the figure I had just frosted on my cookies. But the white beard and the kindly eyes were the same. I was trembling so much my legs would not hold me, so I sat down on a stool and looked up at the saint standing so near I could have touched him. His eyes regarded me with such sadness it made me want to weep. St. Nicholas said softly, "I spent my whole life giving money to those in need, helping the sick and suffering, and caring for little children, just as our Lord taught us. God, in His mercy, has been generous to us, and we should be generous to those around us." I could not bear to look into his eyes, so I buried my face in my hands. Is an extra cookie such a terrible price to pay for the generosity God has shown to us? He asked gently, touching my head with his hand. Then he was gone. A moment later, I heard the shop door open and footsteps approach the counter. I knew before I looked up that the ugly old woman had returned to ask me for a dozen St. Nicholas cookies. I got up slowly, counted out 13 cookies, and gave them to the old woman, free of charge. She nodded her head briskly. "The spell is broken," she said. "From this time onward, a dozen is 13. And from that day onward, I gave generously of my baking and of my money, and 13 was always, for me, a baker's dozen."